The Metro Conference. Once upon a time, it was a non-football league built up of some of college sports' odds and ends that didn't have a major conference at the time. It was founded in 1975 with members Cincinnati, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Memphis, St. Louis, and Tulane, but would eventually add schools like Florida State, Virginia Tech, and South Carolina. At one point in time, you could argue that the Metro Conference was the first power conference in all sports but football to have been created essentially purely from independence. But then, of course, it fell apart, mostly because of the fact that it lacked a football league, losing teams like Florida State to the ACC and South Carolina to the SEC. In order to avoid this outcome, though, the Metro had a plan to create a football league that would have been so large it would have encompassed most of the eastern United States. This plan, originally devised in 1989, would have created one of the country's first superconferences, and the only one in the modern era, containing 16 schools stretching from the Northeast to the Bayou South. But the original plan had Penn State involved, who left for the Big Ten in 1989, and after losing Florida State in 1990, the plan fell apart. The Metro would eventually become the Conference USA, and plans for this massive football league fell apart. What's odd about the Metro, though, is that nearly every single one of the members of this proposed superconference would have had the capabilities to be a power school. Let's see what I mean by that. Of the 16 original members, 11 are currently considered Power 5 schools in 2024. Of the 5 that are not, Temple, East Carolina, Memphis, Tulane, and Southern Miss, 2 are consistently brought up in talks to join Power 5 conferences today. Tulane and Memphis, specifically, are considered every time someone talks about potential Pac-12 or ACC expansion, and they were even on the shortlist for Big 12 expansion a few years ago. I've already talked about the woes Temple has faced in finding a power conference home, and in that same video I talked about USF, who was also a short-lived member of the Metro. St. Louis still doesn't sponsor football. But these two schools, East Carolina and Southern Miss, are never brought up in power conference expansion conversations anymore, if they ever were. Why is that? The Metro clearly wasn't a marriage of convenience, since the rest of these schools either showcased high ceilings or high potential in other areas. So why aren't these schools brought up anymore in those conversations? In today's video, we're going to focus on the first of these two schools, ECU. So swab the poop deck and load up on vitamin C, mateys, because this is the wasted potential of ECU. Like I've said a few times, football drives the realignment bus more than anything else. And for East Carolina, that's East Carolina, not Eastern Carolina, mind you, they don't really have much history to stand on in that department. Lots of more Eastern-based college football programs, especially in the Southern and Atlantic states, began their programs in the late 1800s, but East Carolina started theirs in 1932. Originally the Teachers, they didn't adopt the name of Pirates until 1934, owing to North Carolina's history with famous pirates like Blackbeard using the shorelines of the state as a hiding place. They played as an independent until 1947, when they joined the NAIA North State Conference, which is now the Conference Carolinas, alongside schools like Appalachian State and Lenoir-Rhyne. The Pirates had a disastrous few seasons, though. It wasn't until 1952 that they made their first bowl game, losing the Lions Bowl to Clarion College, and then losing the Elks Bowl the following year to Morris Harvey. It would be another 10 years before ECU found themselves in another bowl game, and by that point, they were independents again. But that didn't last long, as they entered the Division I SoCon by 1965 after a stretch of 3 seasons where they went 9-1 and won their first bowls. Arguably the greatest stretch in ECU football history came under Pat Dye at head coach from 1974 to 1979, where the Pirates went 47, 18, and 1. They would stay in the SoCon until they found another chance to move up, this time to the highest level of football competition, Division I-A, in 1978. They'd finished their time in that conference with 4 conference championships. They would do this in a new stadium, Dowdy-Ficklin Stadium, built in 1963, which was essentially a major college stadium for a not-major school. Originally built with less than 20,000 capacity, Dowdy-Ficklin ballooned to 35,000 in 1978. The independent situation in college football in the late 70s and 80s was something of a mess, to be honest with you. Nowadays, there are only a few teams that don't have a conference home, and they're constantly looking for ways to change that, unless their name is Notre Dame. But as I've mentioned before with conferences like the Airplane Conference, Joe Paterno's Northeast Conference, and even the Big East's Football Conference, Eastern independent schools were some of the biggest football powerhouses at the time, and there were a lot of them. In 1978, there were 33 independent schools, just 4 of which could be considered Western. ECU was instantly one of the better ones, going 9-3 in 1978 and winning the Independence Bowl against Louisiana Tech, then 7-3 in 1979. They earned their first postseason ranking in 1983 before falling into a stretch of really bad seasons. It all came to a head in 1991.
They're going to try a field goal. They're going to try and tie this thing. A 49-yard field goal attempt. We'll play for the tie. The Wolfpack will play for the tie, folks. Hartman will kick it. It is up, and it is no good. Pirates win. You can see.
The still independent Pirates, led by former Wyoming head coach Bill Lewis, were an inconsistent football team that hadn't made a bowl since the Independence Bowl in '79, despite some occasionally good win totals. The fact of the matter was that bowl games at that point were mostly tied into conferences, without many slots for independent teams, and if a bowl didn't think your fan base would travel to the game, oftentimes they didn't invite you, even if you deserved it. That didn't matter much for ECU in the 80s, though, because they only had 3 winning seasons in those 10 years. But 91 was different. Led by future NFL Pro Bowler Jeff Blake at quarterback, the Pirates improved from 5-6 to a shocking 11-1 season, knocking off number 15 Syracuse, number 23 Pitt, and number 21 NC State in the Peach Bowl to finish the year on an 11-0 run. Blake finished the season with 3,073 passing yards, 28 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions in what was still very much a league dominated by the run game, finishing 6th in Heisman voting. If the Independents were a conference, ECU would have won it technically, over number 4 Florida State and number 3 Penn State. Ultimately, this would be about the worst thing that could have happened to ECU. Instead of keeping their momentum, Bill Lewis tore it all down by leaving ECU for Georgia Tech, where he'd go 11-19 and be fired before the end of the 1994 season, never to be a head coach again. ECU would replace him by elevating offensive coordinator Steve Logan, who would struggle to rally the team in 1992 and 1993, but would eventually help lead the Pirates to a 7-5 season in 94, then a bowl-winning season in 95 off the back of a 9-3 record, and then an 8-3 season without a bowl berth in 96. By 1996, though, it was apparent that being an independent wasn't doing East Carolina any favors. Not only were they making less money without a conference payout, but their lack of a conference tie-in was keeping them out of bowl games despite finishing seasons with winning records. That all changed in 1997, when the newly formed Conference USA, founded by a merger between the Metro Conference and Great Midwest Conference, offered them a spot for membership. Like I mentioned before, ECU was considered a candidate for the Metro's football superconference due to their clearly solid football capabilities and facilities, as well as a location in a major southern metro. ECU officials saw an opportunity to present themselves as one of the better football schools in the conference, expanding Dowdy-Ficklen again, this time to 43,000 seats. ECU would slowly become a threat in Conference USA, going 9-3 in 1999 and 8-4 in 2000 before losing momentum and going 6-6 in 2001. By 2002, East Carolina had gone 4-8, and Steve Logan had lost his grip on the program. They moved on to a new coach, John Thompson, in 2003, who was incapable of leading the Pirates to much better. He went 1-11 in 2003, then 2-9 in 2004. Fearing that they'd lost momentum, ECU pivoted quickly at head coach and turned to Lou Holtz's son, Skip, who had some experience as head coach at UConn from 1994 to 1998 and had been the assistant head coach at South Carolina from 1999 to 2004. He proved to immediately be able to bring the Pirates back to CUSA contention, going 5-6 in 2005 and then going back to making a bowl in 2006 after a 7-5 season. They'd go 8-5 in 2007, winning the Hawaii Bowl over number 24 Boise State. 2008 brought about what could really be the second golden age of Pirate athletics, in a stretch that lasted until 2014. The Pirates won back-to-back Conference USA titles, and once Skip Holtz left East Carolina for what was seen as a better job in USF, ECU signed Texas Tech associate head coach Ruffin McNeil to their head coaching position. McNeil brought over Lincoln Riley to be his offensive coordinator in ECU's new air raid offense, and the 2010 Pirates showed it. Despite going 6-7 and losing their bowl game, ECU QB Dominique Davis led the conference in passing yards and passing touchdowns, and ECU in general had one of the most dynamic offenses in the country. This was followed by a 2011 season where they went 5-7, and then an 8-5 2012 season where they barely missed out on a conference championship game berth against UCF and lost the New Orleans Bowl to Louisiana. Despite a 10-3 season in 2013, ECU missed the conference championship game again, but finally had gained enough momentum to join the Big East Conference, which at one point had been a power conference at the football level. Only there was one problem. The Big East football branch was dead, and had separated entirely from the basketball branch due to its successful schools leaving for other conferences, leaving what was left, the American, as a non-power conference. ECU had missed the Power 5 boat, and now they had to walk the plank. After going 8-5 in 2014, the Pirates struggled to a 5-7 year in 2015. Part of this was due to losing Lincoln Riley to Oklahoma as Bob Stoops' new offensive coordinator, and the Pirates' offense sank from 23rd in points per game to 76th under Dave Nickel. But that's when the ECU administration did just about the worst thing they could have done: fire Ruffin McNeil. ECU definitely wasn't destitute when they hired McNeil, but they hadn't been in a great spot, and sustained success was something that had dodged them time and time again, mostly because coaches that did have success would leave at the first opportunity they got. Look at Holtz and Lewis. Those that stuck around either weren't good or drove the program into the ground again, like Steve Logan. McNeil not only had some sustained success, going 43-34 as head coach of the Pirates with 5 bowl appearances and an appearance in the CUSA title game, despite playing in the stacked East Division, but he wanted to coach there. He wasn't interested in using ECU as a launchpad for a new job. He wanted to be the coach that helped bring ECU into a power conference, like the Big 12 or ACC, who were looking for new members from 2010 to 2015. But after one down season without their offensive coordinator, ECU athletic director Jeff Comfer chose to fire him. This immediately earned uproar from ECU fans who knew that Coach McNeil was the only coach to bring them sustained success. But Comfer stuck to his guns, saying, quote, "In my opinion, the trajectory of the program was not going in the right direction. I felt like we needed to make this decision now and not wait a year and potentially be faced with the same situation." He proceeded to hire Scotty Montgomery to be ECU's head coach. Coach Montgomery killed any chance of momentum ECU had towards joining a power conference by going 3-9 for 3 straight seasons. Where Coach McNeil consistently won games against regional Power 5 opponents, Montgomery did not. In 2018, he was fired from ECU, and so was Jeff Comfer, but the damage had already been done. ECU had finished last or second to last only in front of UConn in all 3 years under Montgomery in the American. UConn dropped out of the American entirely. ECU was just bad. The once threatening Jolly Roger, now a white flag. In 2019, the team tried to pivot by hiring a new skipper, Mike Houston, who had spent the last 3 seasons operating the ship up north at FCS James Madison. At first, he did an admirable job, rebounding from 3-9 in 2018 to 4-8 in 2019. After the 2020 season, he went 7-5 in 2021, and then 8-5 in 2022. There was some hope that would mean some positive momentum for the future. And then he sank the Pirates' ship again, going 2-10 in 2023. He lasted the first 7 games of the 2024 season, compiling a record of 3-4, before he too was fired, leaving offensive coordinator Blake Harrell as the captain of the ship for the remainder of the season. ECU finally turned it around a little bit, finishing the year at 7-5, and earning Coach Harrell the nod as the team's head coach going into 2025. But these waters are bleak. Ever since the new teams joined the American a couple seasons ago, East Carolina has been overshadowed in terms of athletics department success, with power conferences way more interested in schools like UTSA, Tulane, or USF. This is a sharp downturn from what people thought even just 10 years ago. The Big 12 vetted ECU back in 2015 and 2016 for a potential expansion, but ultimately decided not to choose the Pirates for a round of expansion that didn't even happen once Texas and Oklahoma started threatening to leave if expansion happened. And the ACC has apparently never been an option because of 4 things: the Tobacco Road schools. Now, this is from notorious cesspit Reddit, so take it with about as many grains of salt as you can find in all of North Carolina. But supposedly, the Tobacco Road schools, North Carolina, NC State, Duke, and Wake Forest, have been throwing their weight around since the 60s to keep East Carolina from joining them as one of the higher-ranking schools in the state. That has apparently taken the form of barring the school from becoming a university as opposed to a college, blocking them from starting a veterinary college, and, in the football realm, blocking their ability to improve facilities or athletics funding. Now, knowing what I know about Tobacco Road, especially considering that NC State considers ECU a rival, It makes more sense that Duke and UNC are the primary culprits here, especially considering how much sway they have within the North Carolina legislature. Compared to the power conference schools in North and South Carolina, ECU would definitely be on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of athletics budget and even city population. But you have to remember that Chapel Hill and Clemson aren't exactly big cities by any sense of the mean, especially compared to Greenville, where ECU is located. Still, they don't really have much to offer the ACC in terms of what that conference already has. As for the Big 12, the markets for BYU, Houston, and Cincinnati won out as schools with a more formed athletics history. It doesn't hurt that those schools had prior history with current Big 12 schools as well, whereas ECU really didn't at the time. That, and the only reason the Big 12 was expanding, nearly 5 years later, was that they were losing their top two brands to the SEC. But regardless of who holds the blame here, Tobacco Road's restrictions they've put on ECU haven't hurt them as much as they've hurt themselves. From 1996 to the present, the years known as the Conference Championship era of college football, the Pirates have gone 169-82, with 12 bowl game appearances and 12 conference titles, a majority of those wins coming under 3 coaches, and a majority of the losses coming in between. Like a true Pirate, they're the victims of a mutiny from their own athletic department, refusing to pull the trigger on improvements time and time again. They have a Power 5 stadium, but not the other facilities necessary to convince recruits that Greenville is a place that can play host to Power 4 football in the future. They also haven't been able to keep talented coaches, and even some of the good coaches get run off. Since firing Ruffin McNeil in 2015, ECU is 40-66 and has played in 1 bowl game. That's hardly a resume that could get a program noticed by a power conference. And yet, for at least the Big 12, the interest was very real. If I had to point a finger at one singular person for ruining the future of ECU athletics, I'd point towards a man who made a really bad decision, Jeff Compher. But past a certain point, ECU controls its own destiny. He was fired. Mike Houston captained the Pirates through murky waters, for sure, but eventually he found the rocks too. Blake Harrell might only be capable of the same, given he was from the same coaching staff. The interim boost is a very real thing, after all. What happens if it wears off? Ironically, from this point at the end of it, it very much feels like the Pirates have missed the boat. They might have been in a race with UCF for the last spot in a power conference, whether they knew it or not, and the Knights won that race. How? By being good at football when it mattered, and being located in a major metro, and having a ton of students. There's a lot of reasons why, but you could point to football success as the major one. SMU was able to buy a spot in the ACC, and they're making the most of it right now. ECU doesn't have the same luxury. But what do you guys think, especially if you're a fan of a Carolina school or know a lot about ECU? Let me know in the comments below. As always, stay safe out there. I'll see you next time.